Queen Camilla tried to humiliate a royal guard, accusing him of misconduct and demanding his removal from a formal palace event. But what she didn't realise was who she was targeting, because that guard had been holding on to a secret for 26 years, a secret tied to the night Princess Diana died. And when he finally broke protocol to speak, he didn't just clear his name. He proved Camilla guilty of Princess Diana's murder, as the one who orchestrated everything. The room went still. The king stood frozen. And Camilla, she didn't walk out. She was thrown out. Now, before we show you how one soldier brought a queen to justice, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and hit subscribe, because this isn't just another royal scandal. It's the truth Diana never got to speak. The chandeliers of Buckingham Palace's Grand Ballroom cast long shadows across polished marble that had witnessed centuries of state dinners, but nothing quite like this. Nearly 200 guests from across the Commonwealth filled the room. Ambassadors adjusting medals, prime ministers checking pocket watch, the quiet rustle of evening gowns against Chippendale chairs. At the eastern wall, positioned just behind the Canadian delegation, stood a figure most guests wouldn't have expected indoors during a formal dinner. Sergeant Major Callum Strathern, Coldstream Guards. Scarlet tunic pressed to mathematical precision, black bearskin standing regulation height, 3 rows of campaign ribbons catching the chandelier light. His pale blue eyes held that particular stillness tourists loved to photograph outside the palace gates. But tonight wasn't for tourists, and Callum wasn't supposed to be here. The herald's voice cut through conversation. Their Majesties, the King and Queen Consort. Charles entered first, nodding to the Archbishop of Canterbury, then to the Prime Minister. Behind him, Queen Camilla moved with practiced grace. Navy silk that seemed to absorb light, diamonds that threw it back in careful flashes. She made it 6 steps before her gaze swept the room and landed on him. The recognition hit her like cold water. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, her composed smile faltered. Then she leaned toward her equerry without breaking stride. Remove him, now! The words sliced through ambient conversation like a blade through silk. Heads turned, crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. Somewhere near the back, a diplomat instinctively looked for press cameras that weren't there. Callum didn't move. Instead, he reached into his tunic and withdrew a cream-coloured envelope sealed with faded red wax. Without shifting from attention, he spoke in the parade ground voice that had carried across 35 years of service. Under Article 4 of the Royal Service Oath, I invoke legacy review. The phrase hadn't been spoken in living memory. Gasps rippled through the diplomatic corps. British officials went rigid. Foreign ministers looked to their aides for translation that wouldn't come because the protocol was older than their governments. Camilla's mouth opened, then closed. The Lord Steward blanched. Near the head table, the Prime Minister rose slowly from his seat, napkin still clutched in one hand. The Royal Protocol Officer whispered something urgent to Camilla. Then, louder, he has the right. For 35 years, Sergeant Major Callum Strathern had never raised his voice. Not during his first tour in Belfast, when the IRA was still planting bombs in shopping districts. Not during his second deployment to Bosnia, when ethnic cleansing was policy. Not during the 2 quiet years he'd spent attached to embassy security in places that didn't officially exist on military maps. They called him Stonewall behind closed doors. Not because he was cold, his mates knew better, but because nothing passed through him that wasn't meant to. He absorbed everything, recorded nothing, said less. That was the compact he'd made with the Crown when they pulled him aside in 1995. The princess needs someone who won't leak, his commanding officer had, sliding a classified posting across the desk. Someone who understands that loyalty means silence. Diana's protection detail was already staffed with the best the Met and Special Branch could provide. But there were areas where official security couldn't go. Private moments, personal conversations. The spaces between public appearances where a princess might let her guard down and speak truths that could topple governments. That's where they put Callum. Not in the convoy, not at the perimeter, but close enough to see everything, positioned to hear what wasn't meant for official ears. For 2 years, he stood outside her private study at Kensington Palace, silent as stone, watching the world's most photographed woman wrestle with demons the cameras never captured. July the 28th, 1919, had started like any other evening walk. Diana had returned from an unannounced visit to a children's hospice in Kent, that particular lightness in her step that came when she'd spent time with kids who saw past the title to the person underneath. She'd nodded to him as she passed, that familiar acknowledgement that said more than words, and asked for no interruptions. An hour later, Camilla Parker Bowles arrived. No official entry, no scheduled appointment. She was let in through a side corridor by a royal attaché who'd since disappeared from palace service entirely. The meeting lasted 27 minutes. Callum had counted every one, standing motionless in the hallway while voices rose and fell behind oak doors that had absorbed more royal secrets than the Tower of London. When Camilla emerged, she paused beneath the corridor's gas lamp sconces, adjusted her coat collar with deliberate precision. Then she looked back toward Diana's closed door with an expression Callum had seen before on faces preparing for battle. Not satisfaction, not anger, resolution. Minutes later, Diana stepped out. Her face had gone pale beneath expertly applied makeup. Her posture held that brittle control of someone fighting not to shatter. In her hand, a folded envelope sealed with her personal wax stamp. "Sergeant Strathern," she said quietly, each word carefully measured. He straightened to full attention. "If anything happens to me, anything at all, this goes directly to Charles. Not the aides, not the press office. To him." She placed the envelope in his gloved hands. The wax was still warm from the candle flame. Through the cream paper, he could feel the weight of words that might change everything. "Promise me," she said, looking into his eyes with the kind of desperate clarity that comes when someone knows they're running out of time. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. She held his gaze for another moment, then turned and walked back into her study. It was the last conversation they ever had. 5 weeks later, she was dead in a Paris tunnel, and the envelope was locked in a military footlocker that had followed Callum through every posting since. He'd never broken the seal, never made copies, never told another soul it existed. But he'd kept it, through quiet reassignments to overseas embassies, through ceremonial postings with no press visibility, through the gradual erosion of his career by unseen hands that filed reports about operational inflexibility and difficulty adapting to changing protocols. Someone, somewhere, had decided that Sergeant Major Strathern was more valuable invisible than honoured. He'd followed orders, as always, but the envelope followed him, until tonight. The moment Callum handed the sealed letter to the Lord Steward, the Grand Ballroom transformed from ceremonial space to crisis chamber. The Lord Steward accepted it with both hands, his eyes fixing on the personal seal, Diana's Crown and D emblem still intact after 27 years. Clipped to the envelope's corner was a recently signed declassification form bearing the letterhead of the Royal Integrity Oversight Commission. "Who authorised this?" the Lord Steward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Callum answered with parade ground clarity. "Permanent Secretary Thurlow, under Article 9, 4 days ago." There were only 2 people in the palace hierarchy who could initiate that process without the sovereign's prior approval. One of them, the Royal Cabinet Secretary, was seated quietly near the Canadian delegation, his face now the colour of old parchment. The Prime Minister's security detail materialised from the room's perimeter like ghosts given substance. 2 aides in midnight blue suits appeared at the ballroom's gilt-framed exits. The Lord Steward's voice carried across conversations that had already died. "All non-essential guests will be escorted to refreshment in the East Wing. This chamber is now under security protocol." Confusion rippled through the diplomatic corps. The Spanish ambassador attempted to protest until he caught sight of the Prime Minister's expression. Within minutes, the ballroom that had held 200 now contained only 13. The constitutional officers required by royal protocol when the Crown faces challenge from within. Camilla remained in her seat, spine straight, hands folded with practiced composure. But one fingertip traced the edge of her bracelet, a nervous habit she thought no one noticed. "Shall we proceed to the marble room?" the Lord Steward asked the Prime Minister. The answer came not in words, but in the slow procession that formed. Guards sealing exits, officials gathering documents, the machinery of constitutional crisis grinding to life with the weight of centuries behind it. The Marble Room had never hosted ceremonies. No red carpets softened the Carrara stone beneath their feet. No portraits smiled down from walls lined with legal volumes sealed behind brass grills. It was a vault in every sense, built to contain truths too dangerous for public consumption, where the business of monarchy was conducted in shadows and whispers. By the time the last door closed, a tribunal had taken shape. Callum sat across from Camilla at a narrow mahogany table, 27 years of silence about to end. Behind them, the constitutional officers required by Article 4, Prime Minister, Archbishop, Royal Legal Council, and the General commanding the Household Division. The Royal Cabinet stenographer stood ready, her pen the only sound as the Lord Steward, now serving as tribunal chair, cleared his throat. This session is convened under Article 4, Royal Service Legacy Invocation. The witness will present submitted evidence. He nodded to the stenographer. Read the contents, please, Slowly. She broke Diana's seal with surgical precision, unfolded cream paper that had absorbed 27 years of secrets, and began reading in a voice that carried the weight of prophecy. If you are reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. I've written these words without advisors, without approval, and without hope that anyone will believe them. But what I say now comes from my own experience, witnessed with my own eyes, spoken in my own hand. Even in death, Diana's presence filled the Marble Room. Her handwriting, the same loops and curves that had signed thank you notes to charities and bedtime stories for her sons, now testified from beyond the grave. Tonight, I met with Camilla, unannounced, unrecorded, unofficial. She entered my home and spoke as though the conversation we were having had already been decided in rooms I wasn't invited to join. Camilla's breathing remained steady, but her eyes had fixed on the grain of the mahogany table. She explained how things would work, how Charles would be happier, how the monarchy needed stability, not the chaos I represented. She used the word requirements, as if my life was a mathematical problem that needed solving. The Archbishop crossed himself quietly. The Prime Minister removed his glasses and began cleaning them with methodical precision. And then she said this, and I will never forget the casualness of it. Even the people's princess can't outlive history's requirements. Some stories need simpler endings. The stenographer paused, glancing up at faces that had gone pale in the marble chamber's harsh. The Lord Steward gestured for her to continue. I don't know if Charles understands what he's aligned himself with. I don't know if he would care if he did, but I know that when she left tonight, she looked back at my door like someone who had just solved a particularly troublesome equation. She's not going to let me walk away from this, and I'm not going to live long enough to explain it myself. The letter's final words settled over the room like dust from a collapsed ceiling. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence stretched until it became its own testimony. Then Callum reached into his tunic again. This time he withdrew a small black cassette tape, its plastic case worn smooth by decades of handling. A strip of masking tape along one edge bore 3 words in block letters, AUG 29, late. I was given this in 2004, he said, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used to report weather conditions, by a man who approached me in a coffee shop near Vauxhall Bridge, former intelligence based on his mannerisms. He slipped it into my coat pocket and said 4 words, "You didn't get this from me." I never saw him again. The Prime Minister leaned forward. Why hold it all these years? Callum looked at him directly. Because until tonight, playing it would have been treason. A portable cassette player appeared on the table. Callum inserted the tape with steady hands. The Lord Steward gave a single nod, and 27 years of silence ended with a soft click. Static filled the chamber, followed by ambient sound. The clink of porcelain, muffled conversations, the acoustic signature of a drawing room where powerful people spoke in careful whispers. Then a voice emerged from the decades-old recording, smooth, cultured, unmistakably Camilla's. Will she comply with the arrangements? A pause. Then a man's voice, distorted but audible. She remains unpredictable. but the route modifications have been implemented as discussed. Another pause. Camilla again, with the casual certainty of someone discussing dinner plans. Then let us hope Paris provides the resolution London could not. The tape clicked to silence. The marble room held that silence like a physical weight. The Archbishop's head had dropped. The stenographer had stopped writing entirely. Even the Prime Minister's aide, who had witnessed constitutional crises, cabinet collapses, and the fall of governments, looked as though he'd been struck. Camilla didn't flinch. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same composed authority that had gotten her through 30 years of public scrutiny. You'll need more than that. But the general commanding the household division was already consulting a file folder. Voice analysis confirms match with archived ceremonial recordings from the same period. Same speaker, same cadence patterns. The Prime Minister's aide left the room without a word. Within moments, the quiet buzz of secure phone calls began in the corridor outside. Cabinet secretaries were being woken up. Constitutional lawyers were checking precedents that hadn't been tested in generations. The Lord Steward looked across the table at Camilla. Your Majesty, do you wish to respond to this evidence? For the first time since entering the marble room, Queen Camilla stood, not with the theatrical dignity of someone addressing Parliament, but with the careful control of a person who understood that every word would be recorded, analysed, and remembered by history. You believe monarchy survives on truth, her voice cutting through the chamber's cold air. But you're wrong, it survives on necessity. She turned to face the tribunal fully, diamonds at her throat, catching light from the overhead fixtures. For 30 years I've watched this institution struggle with sentiment. Diana was beloved, yes. But love and governance are different requirements. The Crown cannot afford the luxury of emotion when hard choices need making. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had made peace with necessary compromises long ago. Did I speak those words? Yes, but context matters more than quotes lifted from shadows. The monarchy required stability. Charles required peace. The nation required clarity about succession. Diana represented beautiful chaos at a time when chaos was a luxury we couldn't afford. She gestured toward the cassette player with dismissive precision. That recording was obtained illegally, stored improperly, and lacks the context that would explain the difference between planning and hoping. I didn't orchestrate her death. I accepted its advantages. The constitutional officers absorbed her words in stunned silence. Even her legal counsel looked as though he wished he were anywhere else. And if you remove me for speaking honestly about institutional requirements, Camilla continued, then you must question every decision made for the Crown's benefit rather than popular approval. Because I did what all of you have done in your private moments. I chose the monarchy over the individual. She returned to her seat with the same measured grace she'd maintained throughout 3 decades of public service. But her hands, previously still, had begun that barely perceptible tremor that comes when practiced composure meets its limits. The Lord Steward was about to respond when the chamber's doors opened without ceremony. Prince William entered alone, wearing the dark service dress of the Blues and Royals, medals from his military service visible against midnight blue wool. The room stood as one, even Camilla. But William's attention went immediately to the envelope on the tribunal table, then to Sergeant Major Strathern, still in full Coldstream dress. Sergeant Major, William said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to command without shouting. Do I have your permission to read her words aloud? Callum gave the slightest incline of his head. They were written for you, sir. William broke the seal that had protected his mother's final testimony for 27 years. His hands remained steady as he unfolded paper that had absorbed decades of secrets. When he began reading, it wasn't just Diana's words that filled the marble room. It was his voice carrying them forward through time. My darling boys, if you are reading this, it means the conversation I feared has finally happened, and I wasn't able to prevent what came next. I need you to know what happened wasn't madness or paranoia. I saw the machinery in motion. I tried to step carefully, to speak softly, to find some path that would let everyone keep their dignity. But the forces around me were always stronger than my voice. His voice never wavered, but something in his bearing suggested the weight of carrying his mother's prophecy for nearly 3 decades. On the night Camilla visited, she made the future clear. I would either step aside gracefully or be folded into history's requirements. She spoke about Charles's happiness, about stability, about the monarchy's need for clear succession. And then she said something I will never forget. Even the people's princess can't outlive history's requirements. Some stories need simpler endings. William looked up from the letter to meet Camilla's gaze directly. If something happens to me, if there's an accident, or I suddenly develop a desire to withdraw from public life, remember this conversation. Remember that Sergeant Strathern heard every word through the door. And remember that not all accidents are accidental, just as not all withdrawals are voluntary. He folded the letter and placed it on the tribunal table with the reverence of someone handling sacred text. My mother was never paranoid, he said to the room. She was precise. William then reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a document bearing the official seal of the heir apparent. I am invoking the Guardian's Exemption Clause under Article 11 of the Royal Service Act. The Lord Steward's face went white. Your Highness, that clause hasn't been invoked since 1839, William finished, when a member of the royal family attempted to subvert parliamentary oversight of Crown decisions. I formally request that Queen Camilla be relieved of all ceremonial duties and removed from palace premises pending full investigation of her conduct. The constitutional machinery that had operated in whispers and shadows for centuries suddenly ground into public view. The Prime Minister's aide returned with a folder of emergency protocol. The Archbishop consulted legal precedents that hadn't been tested in living memory. The general commanding the household division confirmed that the Guardian's exemption carried the force of royal prerogative when supported by material evidence. Camilla remained seated, her composure intact, but her breathing slightly shallow. When she finally spoke, her voice carried resignation rather than defiance. It won't change what happened, she said quietly, and it won't bring her back. No one replied. The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. But Prince William stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had waited 27 years to speak his mother's truth. No, he said, but it will make sure the record is finally accurate. The Lord Steward rose from the tribunal bench, the weight of constitutional precedent settling over his shoulders like a ceremonial robe he'd never wanted to wear. By order of this tribunal, and under authority of the Guardian's exemption, as invoked by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, Queen Camilla is hereby relieved of all ceremonial functions and requested to withdraw from palace premises under escort. The words landed in the marble room like stones in still water, their implications rippling outward through centuries of royal protocol. Camilla stood slowly, adjusting her coat with the same precision she'd maintained throughout 30 years of public scrutiny. She didn't look at William, didn't acknowledge the tribunal. Her eyes remained fixed on some distant point, beyond the marble walls, as if she were already planning her withdrawal from a stage she'd never wanted to leave. Sergeant Major Strathern will provide escort, the Lord Steward continued, his voice carrying the formal weight of constitutional authority. Callum stood without being asked, his bearing unchanged by the historic nature of the moment. For 35 years he had escorted royalty, protected secrets, and maintained the silence that held monarchies together. Tonight, he would escort someone out of history. The procession that formed was unlike any that had ever moved through Buckingham Palace's corridors. No red carpets softened their footsteps on polished marble. No ceremonial guard flanked their path. No photographers captured the moment for official records. Just a woman in navy silk, walking beside a soldier whose silence had finally found its voice, moving through hallways that had absorbed more secrets than they'd ever released. Palace staff stepped into doorways as they passed, recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in the institutional balance they'd spent careers maintaining. There were no whispers, no shocked gasps. Just the awareness that comes when the unthinkable becomes inevitable. At the side entrance where Camilla had first arrived 30 years earlier as Charles's companion, she paused. Not dramatically. She wasn't given to drama, but with the measured consideration of someone taking a final look at a life that was ending. "She won't be the last," she said quietly. "Not to Callum, but to the palace itself. This institution consumes everyone who tries to change it." Callum didn't reply. His duty was escort, not conversation. But as he opened the door that would close on 3 decades of royal service, he spoke the first words he'd offered voluntarily in 27 years. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the respect due to rank even when rank was being stripped away. "The car is waiting." She stepped through the doorway into London night that held no crowds, no cameras, no record of a Queen Consort becoming a private citizen in the space between one footstep and the next. The door closed behind her with the soft finality of history turning a page. Back in the Marble Room, the constitutional officers began the careful work of managing a crisis that would reshape British monarchy. Legal precedents were consulted, emergency protocols activated. The machinery of government adjusted to accommodate a truth that had been 27 years in the telling. But Sergeant Major Callum Strathern didn't participate in those discussions. His duty was complete. The envelope had been delivered. Diana's words had found their intended recipient. The silence that had protected a lie for nearly 3 decades had finally broken. He removed his ceremonial gloves, placing them beside his bearskin on the marble ledge with the precision that had marked every movement of his military career. Then he stood at attention one final time, not for ceremony but for completion. Prince William approached him, speaking not as heir to the throne, but as a son whose mother's truth had finally been heard. "Thank you," he said simply. Callum gave a single nod. "She deserved better, sir." "Yes," William replied. "She did." Without fanfare, without the sound of drums or pipes or royal announcers, Callum turned on his heel and marched from the Marble Room. Each footstep echoed off stone that had witnessed the rise and fall of kings, the weight of his service finally lifting from shoulders that had carried royal secrets since before William was born. As the doors closed behind him, the constitutional officers continued their work of reshaping a monarchy that had just learned the difference between loyalty and truth. But in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, something quieter had shifted. The silence that protected institutions had given way to the voice of one man who understood that sometimes the greatest service is knowing when to speak. The envelope was empty now. Its contents had become part of the historical record, preserved not in shadows, but in sworn testimony that would outlast the marble walls containing it. Diana's truth had taken 27 years to surface. But once spoken, in the voice of a man who had kept faith with both duty and conscience, it could never be buried again. Some secrets, when finally told, don't just change the present, they rewrite the past and redirect the future. And sometimes the most important witnesses are those who wait decades to find their voice, then speak with the quiet authority that brings down queens. Now let me ask you something. After hearing what really happened in those palace corridors, what do you think? Was Sergeant Major Strathern right to break 27 years of silence, or should some secrets stay buried to protect the institution? Do you believe Queen Camilla's removal was justice finally served, or was it too late to matter for Diana? And should more classified documents from that era be unsealed, or are there some truths too dangerous for democracy? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story changed how you see those red uniforms standing guard outside the palace gates, if it made you realize there's more happening behind that ceremonial stillness than anyone imagined, then hit that like button right now. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because tomorrow we've got another story that'll show you what really happens when loyalty to truth conflicts with loyalty to power. And share this video with someone who still thinks the crown always protects its own. Because tonight, we learned that sometimes the greatest protection the crown can receive is from those brave enough to speak the truth about what it's become. There's another investigation waiting for you right on your screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another reminder that in the corridors of power, silence isn't always golden. Sometimes it's just complicit. Thanks for watching Guard Watch, and remember, not all guards stay silent forever.